What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture. It's a place of history. It's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution.
For the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment, what I saw these young African Americans doing, was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's program. My name is Dr. Michelle Commander, and I am Deputy Director of Research and Strategic Initiatives here at the Schomburg Center. In this role, I am proud to oversee the Lapidus Center for the Historical Analysis of Transatlantic Slavery, which was founded in 2014 via a generous $2.5 million gift from Ruth and Sid Lapidus. The Lapidus Center generates and disseminates scholarly knowledge and works on the slave trade, slavery, and anti-slavery pertaining to the Atlantic world. The center supports the work of researchers with long-term and short-term fellowships. Given the centrality of Atlantic slavery to the making of the modern world, the Lapidus Fellowships ensure that slavery studies are a cornerstone of the Schomburg Center's broader research community. The center engages the public with a variety of programs, an annual nonfiction book prize, exhibitions, conferences, and partnerships with local, national, and international institutions. Tonight's program is a collaboration between the Lapidus Center, the Historical Society of the New York Courts, the New York State Archives, and the New York State Unified Court System. I would like to thank the Schomburg Center's Director Joy Bivens and our Deputy Director for Operations and External Engagement, Kevin Matthews, for their support of this program. The Associate Curator of the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Division, Barry Brown, put together the fabulous pop-up exhibit that you all probably saw as you walked in, and she did a wonderful job. Justice Diane Renwick, Allison Morey, and Marilyn Marcus from the Historical Society of the New York Courts, Jim Foltz and Tom Roller from the New York State Archives, and Paul O'Neill, the current Commissioner of Jurors for Ulster County, were instrumental in planning this event. Finally, I would like to thank our Schomburg Center volunteers, our security team, and our facilities team for making this event happen as well. Before I invite our full panel to the stage, I would like to welcome Justice Diane Renwick, one of the planners for this evening's program, to the podium to offer some brief remarks. Justice Renwick is a lifelong resident of the Bronx. After graduating from the Academy of Mount St. Ursula High School, she earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Cornell University and a Juris Doctor degree from Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law. Justice Renwick began her career at the Legal Aid Society and went on to the Federal Defenders of the Eastern District of New York before ascending to the bench in 1997. She has served as a New York City Housing Court judge, a judge of the Civil Court of the City of New York, and a justice of the Supreme Court of the State of New York. In 2008, Justice Renwick was appointed to the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court of the State of New York for the First Judicial Department. She was the fourth woman and the first African-American woman to serve in the first department since its creation in 1894. It's amazing. Over the years, Justice Renwick has demonstrated an unshakable commitment to advancing issues of the bench, bar, and community in different capacities, sitting on numerous boards and participating in several programs. She is currently the chair of the Appellate Division, First Department's Anti-Bias Committee, and the vice chair of Special Projects for the Historical Society of the New York Courts. Please join me in welcoming Justice Diane Renwick to the stage.
Good evening and welcome. Dr. Commander, thank you very much for that warm introduction and for sharing the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, your second home, I imagine, and the perfect venue for what is, I'm sure, will be this evening's most interesting and exciting program. Sojourner Truth, Slavery and the Justice System, the Importance of Preserving Court Documents. This program is presented by the Historical Society of the New York Courts and the Schomburg Center in collaboration with the New York State Archives and the Unified Court System. This year, the Historical Society of the New York Courts is celebrating its 20th anniversary and its mission of preserving, protecting, and promoting the legal history of New York State. We achieve our mission through public programs like this one, educational outreach to students across the state, publications, oral histories of the bench and bar, exhibits, and other inventive ways to highlight the role of New York's courts in society. We also have webinars, podcasts, and live lectures like this one. All our programs are open to the public. Most are free. Every one of them is interesting and informative. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a program on justice for the disabled about Willowbrook State School. And in about 2 weeks from now, we'll have a webinar on who owns a photo of your face about the right to privacy. So if you want to learn more about the history of New York State as it has been shaped by our laws, please join the Historical Society of the New York Courts. The subject of tonight's event, Sojourner Truth's landmark case to free her son, is nothing short of a triumph. I think we would all agree to that. Born into slavery, Sojourner Truth freed herself and then began the process of restoring her family with the suit in Ulster County, New York. While the records of the case were initially preserved, at some point in the ensuing 200 years, they were lost, or at least no one realized that it was there, and only recently recovered in the New York State Archives. Apparently, they were there all along. This program will tell the story of Sojourner Truth's courage, but also the importance of preserving records for future generations to learn from the past. One of the takeaways, I think, of tonight's lecture is that we should not take for granted the need to preserve records for posterity. We must be diligent in our efforts, even in our personal lives, to preserve our records, old photos, letters, deeds, perhaps tucked away in a closet or an attic. All of these tell the story of our lives and provide context to our history. As a black person, I cannot ignore the legacies that the legacies of slavery still linger in our society. As anyone even vaguely familiar with the social conditions in contemporary America knows, we still face the problem of the color line. The dream that race might someday become an insignificant category in our civic life often seems naively utopian. So it's impossible not to reflect from time to time, sometimes all the time, on the impact of slavery on our ancestors and ourselves. One cannot help but notice when you walk into a boardroom and you're the only black person, when you go into a classroom and you're the only one, when you enter a nice store and you're followed. They are myriad ways one is reminded that the stigma of slavery and racism remains even today, unfortunately. This should not necessarily be a surprise. After all, black history was largely suppressed, distorted, and erased. Fortunately, in recent times, astute historians, tenacious journalists, and keen archivists, like the ones we have this evening, Tom Ruller and the Commissioner of Jurors from Ulster County, Paul O'Neill, have demonstrated that, in truth, black history is a history of people, of insurmountable determination, intelligence, strength, and hope. Sojourner Truth exemplifies such a person, a resourceful, undeterred black woman at a time when it was tough enough to be black, let alone a woman. As an abolitionist and a women's rights activist, Sojourner Truth defied her times and has long been a heroine of mine. I very much look forward to hearing from Dr. Irvin Painter, a renowned historian, and retired a professor of Princeton University, about Miss Truth's life. Even today, Sojourner Truth is a role model of resilience and persistence for adults and children alike. For a while, Sojourner Truth was a household name in my home, as one of my sons did a grade school project about her. I'm not saying he was forced or anything, but we did have two quite large laminated posters of her in our house for several months. I have always loved her women's rights speech, commonly referred to as the Ain't I a Woman speech, and find it to be one of history's most memorable speeches on the intersection of women's suffrage and black rights. It is incredibly powerful and inspirational in any era, but particularly when one considers the era in which it was delivered. You might imagine that I was truly, absolutely thrilled when I learned that this incredible piece of history had been unearthed from the archives. Today, Sojourner Truth's legacy as a pioneer in both the women's rights movement and the anti-slavery movement is well established worldwide. But almost 200 years ago, the use of laws written by citizens of our state to protect a woman for whom those laws most surely were not written or intended to protect was quite rare indeed. It remains a bright spot in our history and a bold and justified mitigation, as a bold and justified mitigation of a grave injustice. This legal feat of Sojourner Truth stands out as an historic first. As the first black woman appointed to the Appellate Division, First Department, and one who chose to practice law and sit on the bench, precisely because of a personal desire to see all people treated equitably, I truly stand on the shoulders of this heroic black woman. Sojourner Truth asked, "Ain't I a woman?" I think we can all answer with a resounding yes, one hell of a woman. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this evening's program.
Thank you so much, Justice Renwick, for those inspiring remarks. The rest of this evening's program will be in 3 parts. First, we will have an overview of Sojourner Truth's life by Dr. Nell Irvin Painter, and then we will follow with a panel discussion about the importance of the archives and the detective story that helped unearth and situate historically the rediscovered court records. And finally, we will wrap up with Q&A with our in-house audience. There are microphones on either side in the back for you to form a queue at the appointed time. I do have a reminder for you all and for myself. Please take a moment to switch off your cell phone ringer and cancel any alarms that you may have forgotten about, as they can be quite disturbing for the speakers as well as your fellow audience members. Thank you very much. So now please join me in welcoming to the stage tonight's panelists. Paul O'Neill Esquire is an amateur historian and current commissioner of jurors for Ulster County. He grew up in New Paltz in Ulster County, New York, and completed his undergraduate studies at SUNY Binghamton. He then attended George Washington University National Law Center and practiced law in New Paltz and then in Kingston for 15 years, including 14 years as an assistant district attorney for Ulster County. He has served in his current position as commissioner of jurors since 2010. Paul, please join us. Thomas J. Ruller is the state archivist of New York. Prior to serving as the state archivist, he served as the director of operations for the Office of Cultural Education in the State Education Department. He was initially hired as a senior archivist in the state archives, eventually serving as a staff member in the newly established Center for Electronic Records. Tom's work with electronic records eventually led him to the Education Department's Division of Information Technology Services, where he managed several statewide system development projects, including the statewide student data system, as well as serving as the Information Technology Coordinator for the Office of Cultural Education, the parent organization of the State Archives, State Library, and State Museum. Prior to his service with New York State, Tom worked as an archivist at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Tom holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and a Master's in Library Science degree. Tom, please join us. Our first speaker will be Dr. Nell Irvin Painter, an award-winning historian of the United States. Dr. Painter is currently the Edwards Professor of American History at Princeton University, and that is a typo, she is emerita. She was a director of Princeton's program in African American Studies from 1997 to 2000, and from 1993 to 1998, Dr. Painter was co-chair of the Schomburg Center's Scholars in Residence program, a program that has supported the research and professionalization of hundreds of Black Studies scholars since its inception nearly 40 years ago. So this is a homecoming of sorts for Dr. Painter. Welcome back to her. Dr. Painter is the author of 7 books and countless articles relating to the history of the American South. Painter's latest book, The History of White People, guides readers through more than 2,000 years of Western civilization, illuminating not only the invention of race, but the frequent and troubling overpraise of whiteness. Dr. Painter's critically acclaimed book, Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol, won the nonfiction prize of the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Painter is also the author of Southern History Across the Color Line, Standing at Armageddon, the United States, 1877 to 1919, which won the Letitia Brown Memorial Publication Prize, the narrative of Hosea Hudson, his life as a Negro communist in the South, Creating Black Americans, and Exodusters, Black Migration to Kansas After Reconstruction. She is at work on a new biography of Sojourner Truth, and I hope she will join us back here at the Schomburg Center once that is published. Let's all try to convince her to do that. Dr. Painter has been featured as a narrator in the PBS historical series American Experience, which combines dramatic reenactments with commentary by historians and authors. Dr. Painter retired from Princeton University's History Department in 2005 and used her newly acquired free time to earn a BFA degree from Mason & Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University in 2009 and an MFA in painting at the Rhode Island School of Design in 2011. No pressure for any of us. Her endearing memoir, if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, please purchase it. Her endearing memoir, which I read with a big smile on my face the entire time, Old in Art School, a memoir of starting over, is about her experiences during that time. What a historian, artist, and inspiration. Everyone, please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Nell Irvin Painter.
Hello. Hello, hello. I bring you greetings from East Orange, New Jersey. Thank you so much. And thank you, Schomburg. Thank you, New York Archives and Archivists and the history of the Archives and Archivists. The Schomburg Center has been a permanent source of essential knowledge, as you saw in the introduction. And the New York State Archives and the Ulster County courts also are in the job of serving, keeping, and presenting the essential knowledge that comes from actual historical documents. So today I want to say a few words about Sojourner Truth, and I want to emphasize her dual existence. So those of us who are here concentrate on particular histories of particular people at particular times and particular places. So we're interested in the historical person who lived mostly in New York State between about 1797, when she was born in Ulster County in the Hudson Valley, and when she died in Battle Creek, Michigan in 1883. So you mentioned that I'm doing a new biography. I have to say it'll come out after my collection of essays called I Just Keep Talking, which Doubleday will publish in early 2024, and which includes some essays, or maybe just one essay on Sojourner Truth. But after that, I will publish a new biography. I think all of you know that I did a biography a quarter of a century ago called Sojourner Truth, A Life, a Symbol. That was the facts of the life and also what Americans have made of that life since she lived it. And part of what they have made, I hate to say this, is equating her with something she didn't say. So the title of my new biography is Sojourner Truth was a New Yorker, and she didn't say that. So the far better known is the symbolic Sojourner Truth, who was a woman who had been enslaved, and therefore, by dint of her enslavement, automatically assumed to have lived and worked in the American South, the everywhere of American Southernness. This widely known Sojourner Truth is commonly evoked in a phrase she is assumed to have uttered, but a white woman said it. Aren't I, or ain't I, let's be blacker, shall we, a woman, which she did not say. And I'll return to that in a bit if you want me to talk more about that. But that's later than this Sojourner Truth we're going to be talking about this evening. So I do want to say that what Judge Renwick said is absolutely true, except for the quote, that Sojourner Truth was there. She was so intelligent. She was so canny. She was like a lot of other women and people who were assumed to be powerless, in that she could draw on the power of some greater source. She called it sometimes the power of the Holy Spirit, and if you're Pentecostal, that will ring very true to you. So she had that in common with millions and millions of other people, and she had a source. I think we would say that source was within her, but she had a source that she would say was greater than her, that let her do truly memorable things. So we're going to talk about her going to court and getting her son back after he had been illegally sold into perpetual slavery. And that was before she became Sojourner Truth. She was still Isabella in Ulster County at that point. We know her as Sojourner Truth, the feminist abolitionist. She was a feminist abolitionist. She was a feminist abolition who showed up, who spoke up, who made her point. She was a great, extraordinarily intelligent and eloquent American, Black American woman. We need to keep all of that about Sojourner Truth, but not in those words. So, Sojourner Truth was remarkable as a preacher, and she started her career as a public person as a preacher. She was involved in the great ferment of the early 19th century, the Second Great Awakening. In New York City, here, well downtown, she was in the Kingdom of Matthias, a truly wacky cult. And in 1843, when Isabella von Wagenen became Sojourner Truth, made herself into Sojourner Truth, the Holy Spirit said to Isabella von Wagenen, "You are a sojourner, and you are going to tell your truth." So she became an itinerant preacher. And the moment she did that, it was the day of Pentecost in June 1843. That was the high point of an American movement called Millerism, in which hundreds and thousands of Americans believed in the numbers that a man named William Miller had figured out, and at the time of the Second Coming. So she started there. She started with Millerism and the Kingdom of Matthias, but she went much farther. She went much farther. In the 1840s, she lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, in a kind of, we might call it a commune. It was the Northampton Association it was a cooperative. And it was a place that brought together the forward-looking spirits of the time, like abolitionists and women's rights people. And she stayed there for many years, and she did well enough in subsequent years to actually buy a house in Northampton. Now, all of you know how difficult it is to buy a house, how expensive it is. And it was also, I don't know of other people who had been, women who had been enslaved in the early part of the 19th century who were able to do that. We know people who were born free or became free who went into business and did that. But this is something that she did before the Civil War. She began her power as a public speaker in Ulster County as part of a movement that we historians call New York Perfectionism, which is part of the Second Great Awakening. So she was already recognized as a potent public figure before she left Ulster County for New York. And she improved on her speaking in the 1840s and the 1850s and the 1860s. While she was in Northampton, she dictated her narrative to a woman who was also there, Olive Gilbert. And so that was the narrative of Sojourner Truth. I had the great pleasure of editing the Penguin Classic edition of that. And for me, part of the importance of her story was the psychological side. This was a woman who had been enslaved, and being enslaved is being in captivity. You are not to think for yourself. You are not to speak for yourself. You are somebody else's creature. She self-emancipated before the state did. So she walked away in 1826. But she began the long psychological process. And part of that was using the court to get her son back. Now, I started my historical career as a historian of the South, and this story could not have happened in the South. New York State, and I say this as a proud New Jerseyan, New York State has a fine legal history, and amazingly, and perhaps uniquely, a woman who had been born enslaved, who had been kept in captivity in her youth and in her young adulthood, was able to use the law. We talk a lot about how wonderful it is to have the rule of law, but we also know that so many people don't have access to that law. And in many other states, the laws don't even exist that people could use. So it's not an accident that Sojourner Truth was able to use the law in the state of New York. Sojourner Truth spent the middle 1840s in Northampton, where she was becoming a feminist abolitionist in addition to being a very powerful speaker. And in 1851, she set out on a book tour because she had her own narrative. And in time-honored practice as an author, she went on her book tour and she visited likely people who would be interested in her book. And so she joined women's rights meetings, including one in Akron, Ohio in 1851. And that meeting, you may know if you know Frances Dana Gage's version of it, which is not quite true. I'll leave that there for now. So during the 50s, she was an itinerant preacher, but she was preaching women's rights and anti-slavery. And she showed up. She showed up and she spoke up. During the Civil War, she, like other women in this movement, moved to Washington, D.C., where she did what was called Freedmen's Aid or Freedmen's Relief. And she actually met President Lincoln, who treated her, I shouldn't say, did someone say badly? Yeah, okay, badly. She comes back into women's history after the Civil War in the controversies over suffrage. You'll remember that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments got rid of slavery, assured citizens' rights to men, put the word male in the Constitution for the first time, and then assured voting rights, those three amendments together. And in the 1860s, the controversy was between white women, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton most prominently, who had been wonderful abolitionists, but they didn't want black men to get the vote before women. And when they said women, they meant women like themselves, because at that time, as in later times, the idea was all the women are white and all the blacks are men. And so for them, it was a contest between white women and black men. And for a long time, for several years between 1865 and about 1867, Sojourner Truth, who was a peacemaker, tried to straddle the two sides. And she said some things that got remembered because they were written down in the history of women's suffrage that made it sound like she was on the Susan B. Anthony's, Elizabeth Cady Stanton side. Finally, she was not. When it became obvious and important in 1867, 1868, that if there were to be women's suffrage, there would not be black men's suffrage. And she came down, as did many other abolitionists who were very torn at this point for black male suffrage. After the Civil War, Truth moved to Battle Creek, Michigan, which was the center of the Adventist, and you may know that the Millerites sort of gave birth to the Seventh-day Adventists. So she stayed within the Adventist world. And she advocated the move of freed people who were unemployed in places like Washington to Kansas and to the West. That did not work out, or at least it didn't work out very much from Washington, D.C. She became a local tourist attraction. Her neighbor, Frances Titus, added a book of life to her narrative. Her two daughters worked as housekeepers and died pretty much in obscurity, but her grandchildren and her later descendants experienced formal education and upward mobility. Sojourner Truth died in 1883 in Battle Creek, and she is very, very nicely buried, and in the last 20 years, Battle Creek has erected a monumental monument in her honor. So that's my quick trip through Sojourner Truth. Thank you.
It's really compelling that Sojourner Truth had lived such a difficult life, but still used the remainder of her life, even after she fought for her son's liberty, for the care of Black people. It's quite amazing that she had the strength and the wherewithal to do that. I'm also compelled by your fascination with her life and dedication to telling the truth, telling the real story of Sojourner Truth's life. And so I have to know what it was like for you, Dr. Painter, to walk into the state archives and see these actual documents rediscovered, uncovered. What did you feel, and how did you react in that moment?
It was overwhelming. Now, I didn't walk into the archives. I walked into the county courthouse in Kingston in Ulster County. And you could see the actual documents. You could also see the blow-ups, as you see, so you can read them. But it's absolutely amazing. I mean, at heart, I suppose I still am a historian. And I could not touch those documents. And when you touch them, you're supposed to wear gloves and like that. But as I mentioned when I was standing there, that the idea that a woman who had been enslaved was working for this extended family who had trafficked her son. That traffic was illegal, but in a great portion of the United States, the trafficking of children was legal. It was not legal in New York. So she was going up against this extended family who were going to be her employers and her daughter's employers. She had been enslaved. She was a Black person. She was a woman. She did not have reading and writing at her hand. She had allies, but she also lived in a state with laws, and she used them. It was absolutely breathtaking.
Yeah. So when you look at the court records themselves, you see this brave woman, Isabella van Wagenen, fighting quite heroically for her child's life, but there is a name that appears often. So this question is for Paul and Tom about Abraham Housebrook. Can you give us a bit more on the overview of the case itself and why it was so significant for its time and the precedent that it set? So who are these key players? We know Sojourner Truth, who was then Isabella, but who else is a kind of unlikely figure who comes out of these newly rediscovered documents?
I'll let you tap. Thank you, Tom. Yes, there are a number of figures who come out, and that's part of what's so interesting about finding these documents, because these are stories that we didn't know before. So I guess really the way to start out is there's really two things to look at. Is one, what happened with this case? And two, as you said, why does it matter? Why is it so important? You said, and you alluded to this case being so significant at the time. I think this case is as significant today. It really is such an amazing case because, as Dr. Painter said, it's the first time that a former enslaved person, a woman no less, sues a white man and wins. I mean, how huge is that? But then you also have to look at, this is someone who's coming in who has relatively little when you're talking about she doesn't have wealth. She doesn't have social standing. She doesn't have familiar relationships. She's suing somebody who has all that and more. And what a wonderful statement for our courts, that here it is. Isn't that what justice is? Justice is a level playing field where anybody can come and justice will prevail. Nothing is perfect, but it did. It really did, and people helped out. So it's important because of that, and I also think that it's important because I believe that this is the pivotal moment in Isabella's life. This is the moment that changed everything. I believe that she goes into the Ulster County Courthouse as a mother desperate for the return of her child. And I think she leaves that courthouse as somebody who is well on the way to being dedicated to freedom, equality, not just for her, not just for her son, but for everybody. And she spends the rest of her life doing it. Yeah. When we had the event in the Ulster County Courthouse that Dr. Painter's talking about, our New York State Assemblyman, Kevin Cahill, said something that I think it really resounded, and I love this statement and I'd like to repeat it. And he said, she came into this courthouse as Isabella. She left as Sojourner Truth, and I think that's very true. Now, she didn't change her name to Sojourner Truth till 1843, almost 20 years later, but I think this is the springboard that takes her to everything else she does. And this is an amazing, amazing person. What she does is, she's an inspiration for us as much today as she was then. If you take this case out, I don't know that any of that happens. So it's incredibly important. And what really happens here, and I can tell you what we believed before Jim Foltz and Tom found these documents and what we believe now. What we believed before is that Isabella leaves, she's enslaved with a family named the Dumonts. John Dumont is her enslaver. They make an agreement in 1825. The law in New York says that slavery ends July 4th, 1827. The truth is there were exceptions to that really, depending on how old you were, you still were going to be a slave. It was just going to be a different name, perhaps indentured servant. But that's when slavery ends officially, July 4th, 1827. So in 1825, she makes an agreement with John Dumont that effectively, if she works hard and she stays true and faithful, he's going to grant her her freedom 1 year early, July 4th, 1826, instead of July 4th, 1827. It's going to free her family as well. Well, at the end of that year, John Dumont reneges on his part of the deal, refuses to free her. That leads to her famous walk to freedom. Now, that was very important to her. She said, I'm leaving. I have no reason to stay. But her mother had told her that it was a sin to run away, so walking was very important. And that's why we look at this, and you could still walk in her footsteps today. In Ulster County, we have that walk to freedom. She walks to a Quaker community. When she gets there, the patriarch of the family is on his deathbed. He sends her to another family that he thinks will help her, the Van Wagenens. And we still have Van Wagenens in our community today. They take her in. She's brought her infant daughter with her. And they ultimately, when John Dumont finds out it's a small community, comes, they buy out the balance of the term of her and her daughter. But her son Peter had been sold by John Dumont to a Dr. Gedney, who was a neighbor. And Dr. Gedney purchases the rights, the services for Peter. And I think what his plan is he's on his way, he's going to New York City, and then he's going to London. And he's going to bring Peter as his manservant. Now, Peter's a small child. He's probably 5 or 6 years old. Get down to New York City, and Dr. Gedney finds that Peter just isn't, he's too young, he's not going to work out. He sends him back up to his brother Solomon. Solomon sells Peter to his brother-in-law and sister who have a plantation in Alabama. That's against the law in New York. New York, due to the impending abolition of slavery, you could not sell a slave out of the state of New York. Sojourner Truth finds this out. She goes to first the Dumonts, then the Gedneys. She knows them both, asking for the return of her son, and they both tell her effectively, no, it's a child, why are you making such a big deal? You could have more. Mrs. Gedney says, she's with my daughter. What do you think? She's not safe? She's being treated like a true gentleman. Now, there is karma in this world, and we can get to what happens later, but she gets no relief. So again, she goes to the Quaker community, and they tell her, you need to go to the courthouse, you need to go to the grand jury. So she walks. She walks to the Ulster County Courthouse in Kingston, New York. If you go to Kingston today, the courthouse that is there is the courthouse that she went to. The front steps are the steps that she walked up. That front door is the door that she walked through. And she starts asking for the grand jury. Now, I think part of this story is we think, Sojourner Truth, she's the focus. The courage that it took for her to do all this is beyond comprehension. The will that she had to never stop in spite of obstacle after obstacle is beyond description. But there's so many other people. That's one of the things that's wonderful about this case. She goes in, she comes up to an attorney who she asks for the grand jury. When she's told to find the grand jury, she thinks that she has to go, the grand jury is a person, and she goes up to the most impressively dressed man that she sees, and she assumes that he's the grand jury. He says, no, he's not the grand jury. He points her upstairs where the grand jury is. She does the same thing upstairs. Gentleman says no. He points her into the grand jury. She goes into the grand jury. She testifies that very day in front of 23 members of the community who've been summoned randomly, and they issue a writ, effectively. And the writ says that Solomon Gedney has to appear in the Ulster County Courthouse, and he has to bring Peter with him. And if he doesn't, he has to pay $500. Well, the Sojourner Truth is told she has to bring this to the constable. The constable has to serve Solomon Gedney. She rushes 8 miles down the road to the constable, gets it to him. He serves Solomon Gedney's brother instead, mistakenly. Solomon Gedney is able to get across the Hudson River and goes to Poughkeepsie in Dutchess County. But he talks to an attorney there, and the attorney tells him, there were different levels under that law of what could happen if you sold somebody out of the state. He tells him the most significant one, which is if you kidnap somebody, and it was a fine of up to $1,000, and it was hard labor of 14 years. Solomon Gedney gets in a steamboat, goes to Alabama, brings Peter back here. Now, so Peter's back, but nothing happens. She goes to the Ulster County Courthouse sometime in the fall. Now we're getting into the new year. She's in the fall of 1827. Now we're in January, February of 1828. She's beside herself. Now she knows Peter's here. She thinks that he might be sold again, and she doesn't understand why he's not being brought to the court. She goes back to the courthouse. She goes back to a man named John Chipp, who seems to be kind of the overseer of the grand jury, and she says, why isn't the law being followed? And he says, you need to have him served. So it seems that he was served, and he does appear, because the only document up until January of this year that we thought we had for this case is a recognizance. It's effectively a bail bond signed by Solomon Gedney, stating that he has to appear subject to a $500 forfeiture of $500 bond at the next criminal court term. At that point, there were so many different courts. The criminal court was called Oyer and Terminer. So he has to appear at the next one. We thought that was the case. He appears, she talks in her narrative about, and I'm sure we would all agree that the most emotional part of her narrative is that court scene. She goes in there, Peter, you know, she isn't in the courthouse at first, and her attorney keeps coming across the road to his law office and saying, Peter's here, but he says you're not his mother. She says, that can't be. It's going back and forth, and finally the judge says, bring her over. She goes over, and there's Peter. He's obviously been beaten, and he's saying that, you know, oh, you're not my mother. The presumption that we had with nothing else is that, you know, that he's told that if he, I presume that he's told that if he says anything, he's not going to be freed. If he
Paul, can I say something here?
Yeah.
I did some reading around in psychology trying to deal with this, and it's called detachment, and especially for children who feel that they have been abandoned. So it wasn't about what had been told him, it was what he felt. He felt that he had been abandoned and he had detached from his mother.
Yeah.
So this is a psychological situation rather than a slavery power situation.
Yeah, and I mean, he's so young that they could have effectively said that she was a monster, and she says that when she's there, he keeps looking at, you say, his owner, which we don't know.
Who was the grown-up he had been with.
Yes, so, but we don't know. I'd assumed it was Solomon Gedney and perhaps his brother-in-law, as if, that's right, you guys here, I'm saying what they're, so we don't know, but clearly he's terrified. They calm him down, judge sees what's going on, and issues an order. And that order is that Peter is leaving that courthouse that day with one person, and that person is his mother. So it really is a monumental case. And everybody knew about this case. She talks about walking down the road and people asking her about this case. How's your case going? So that's what we thought existed, because the only thing we had was this recognizance, this bail bond. Our county clerk in Ulster County is a woman named Nina Posupak, who's absolutely wonderful, and our archives are Taylor Bruck and Lori Hancock and a number of others, spectacular. Our archives is really second only to the state archives that Tom controls. And we've wondered for so long, why wouldn't we have more documents? First of all, we have documents going back there. All documents are kept, the court records, but this was a case that they knew at the time was a huge case. It wouldn't be just misplaced or thrown away or anything like that. We couldn't understand. So that's what we believed happened. Fast forward to January of this year, when Jim Foltz in the state archives finds these documents. Now, we had always believed locally, and this is from parts of her narrative and local lore, that there was an individual named Abraham Brune Hasbrook, very, very prominent member of the community. He's an attorney, he's a congressman, he ends up later being the first lay president of Rutgers University, founds the Ulster County Historic Society, very, very well-known individual. So we always knew that he was involved in this case. We knew he wasn't one of the actual attorneys of the case, but we didn't know what his role was. We believed that he was kind of the money behind it, that he was the impetus behind it, that he knew that this was a test case, even if she may not have. We also believed that she was working for him as a domestic servant at the time of the case. When we find the documents, we find that there's not one case going on, there's two cases. One is the one that we have this recognizance for. That's a criminal matter. Now, Tom and Jim find a writ of habeas corpus. And a writ of habeas corpus is, I think habeas corpus means in Latin to produce the body. And what you usually see it for is if somebody is incarcerated illegally, they're not given an opportunity to come to court to explain why they shouldn't be or submit any defenses. You submit a writ of habeas corpus. It's one of the most important proceedings we have. You don't see it much, but it's so basic and integral to our rights that you're required to be produced to a court to be able to say, to say why you shouldn't be there. That's why it's a big deal in war. Sometimes you can suspend the right of habeas corpus. What that means is, in times of true difficulty, a president or somebody can imprison, say, someone from the press for no reason at all, and they have no recourse to the courts. That's what that means. So we find this writ of habeas corpus filed on behalf of Peter, really. There are the documents that you see outside, and one of the things that is amazing, and the first time I saw it, it really put a chill up my spine to see that X she makes. And to think, it looks so simple, but what was going through her mind when she put that there? You know, she's desperate to get her child back, but she knows that she's aligning herself against all the powers that be. She has people behind her, but she's afraid, but she does it. And we find out that this Abraham Brune Hasbrook, who we know as A. Brune Hasbrook because he had a cousin named Abraham to avoid confusion, is the judge. It's not really, he's a commissioner appointed with the powers of a Supreme Court judge. So we're in a different court. We find out that someone that we thought was behind the scenes couldn't have been less behind the scenes. And it really changed everything. And one of the things that most of what we've seen so far, what we believed before the finding of these documents, is we saw everything from her eyes, from her perspective. And it really changed everything. It allow us to step back, see a little bit more of the mechanisms going on. But so Solomon Gedney signs this recognizance February 21st. March 1st, the petition for habeas corpus is filed actually in Albany. It's signed in Albany. Kingston attorney, it wasn't an easy trip to get up to Albany then. So I did check. 1828 was a leap year. So there was a February 29th in February of 1828. But really, in 9 days, Solomon Gedney appears with the signs the recognizance. Writ of habeas corpus is filed on March 1st. The order is signed March 14th, and Peter's freed to Sojourner Truth. The court system, I always say, look, justice moves. It may move slowly, but it moves. This moved very fast. Very, very fast. So we've learned so much about some of the people involved, all from these documents. And I mean, the reason we're really here is to discuss not only Sojourner Truth, not only the inspiration that she is and she will always be, but without these documents, we don't have a clear picture. And if we didn't even have the recognizance before, we would have known even less.
Mm-hmm. As we were preparing for this event, the phrase detective story kept coming up. It didn't mean that there were any law enforcement officials involved in the discovery, of course. But the uncovering is quite amazing. This was the work, the skill, and the luck of an archivist. Tom, tell us what an archivist is and does, and what kind of training they typically have. And then take us through the moment of discovery. Was your colleague Jim Fultz looking for these records? How did this all come about?
Okay, I'll try to do that in 30 seconds.
No
Archivists really have three primary responsibilities. The first is preservation, ensuring that these essential materials that document our communities, our people, are preserved and protected, because there's only one copy of them. And it's not a copy, they're all originals. If they're gone, they're gone. And there's no record of them. There's no existence after that. So we do preservation. We do access. One of the most important jobs that we have is taking these materials that we've preserved and ensuring that people have access to them, discovering the contents of them. Now, there are a lot of records that are preserved in archives across the planet. So access requires quite a bit of extra work in terms of describing and indexing, et cetera. But the provision of access, and in the case of government archivists, the provision of access is sometimes a fine line because we also have the responsibility to protect people's privacy, et cetera. But that's a whole other conversation. And then the last thing that archivists do is the hardest job of all. People produce, especially now, enormous quantities of information. Government produces enormous quantities of information. The New York Public Library produces enormous quantities of information. Not all of it is worthy of permanent protection and permanent preservation. The archivist is the person, the individual, that determines what will be saved and what will be consigned to the dustbin of history. That is the hardest job of all. It's easy when you're dealing with the records of the Dutch administration of New Netherland colony because we're keeping all of it. But it's not so easy when you're dealing with the records of the Office of Price Administration, which managed the price of food during World War II. Huge differences. It's a very, very hard job. And now move into the electronic era and think of all the information that you created in the last hour on your Facebook, your Twitter, your email, or whatever else you happen to do. How much of that is worthy of permanent preservation? I'm sure for everyone here, all of it is, we know. But it's a very, very difficult challenge. The challenge of preservation and access also get connected in when we talk about the digital environment. Now, I work at the New York State Archives, where we protect, preserve, and make available the permanently valuable records of New York's colony and state. So our collection begins in 1630 and ends right now. So we're collecting records constantly. But just of the government, just of New York State's government, including the courts. So we have about 8,000 boxes, imagine a box like this, of records of the New York courts system from 1690 until 1847. Many of those records are in their tri-folded documents. Take a road map about that size, take a piece of legal paper, try to make them look the same. So it's a little tri-fold. Boxes and boxes and boxes of densely packed pieces of paper with one notation on the outside of what it is. I have guaranteed lifetime employment because it will take us forever to index and describe all of that to make it easily accessible. We're in the process now of trying to provide information and guidance for historians, for legal scholars, for genealogists, for whomever, of how to use the court records that we keep, which are complicated. I've already told you they're voluminous, but they are rich. They're extremely rich with the stories of average people, like Isabella van Wagenen, who's much more above average, yes. But this is how the deal went down. My colleague Jim Foltz is working on the book that will guide you through court records and help you understand the differences between a writ of you say the word. Certiorari. It's good to have an attorney near you. Certiorari, or a writ of habeas corpus, and all the other forms of documents that come out of the court system and that lawyers and judges produce. Because it's complicated, but we're writing a guide. Jim was in our collection in one of those boxes that is dense with these documents, a box of writs, and he's looking for a good example. This is a great example of what a writ looks like and how you understand the contents and what it means. Jim is an amazing historian with a mind like a steel trap. And as he's looking through the documents, which simply have Gedney versus Van Wagenen or whatever on the outside, that's all it says, Jim recognizes that name. He knows Isabella Van Wagenen. He knows Van Wagenen means something. It could be one of the many people from Ulster County who are suing somebody else for land or whatever, but Jim's curiosity is piqued. He pulls that document out and that's how he discovered it. And these 4 legal instruments, the writ of habeas corpus, Isabella van Wagenen's affidavit talking about it, which we have on the big boards outside, where she signed it with an X. Solomon Gedney's response to the writ of habeas corpus. Peter? Peter who? That's the summary of that particular document from the non-lawyer perspective. And then finally, the order releasing Peter to his mother and freeing him henceforth. Those 4 pieces of paper introduce all the characters in this, clarify what really happened, and fulfill the entire story. Jim found them because they were a needle in a very big haystack. At the State Archives, we have 175,000 of these boxes, which if you stack them all end to end is a little over 26 miles of material. So that's my 30-second, actually 45-minute response.
There was not a time limit, but that was really great. Thank you so much for sharing the discovery process. You know, I have a question, I have a series of questions actually they're generally about the legacies of this case. I'm really curious about the sort of early legacies, so the kinds of cases that come out in the 19th century that were brought about by Black individuals that may have been inspired by Sojourner Truth's case, but also the more recent kinds of legacies that we see. So we have a number of attorneys and other folks who are attending this program either in-house or virtually for continuing education credits, CLE credits, which is quite phenomenal, wonderful. But I do wonder what the stakes are of slavery's long history on the legal field, particularly when it comes to Black people's trust and mistrust of the American justice system. Of course, this is a case where justice was served, but we know that in her moment in the 19th century, and certainly in Reconstruction and afterwards, Black folk had a tough time getting justice for all manner of reasons, and it still exists today. So what are some of the things that we can perhaps impart to those who are attorneys, who are charged professionally with seeking truth, justice, and liberty, and what are those kind of ethical considerations that they have to keep in mind that a case like this can show, but other cases throughout history as far as Black Americans might be able to show them as well. And there's a lot in there, so if you could just jump in, what sticks out for you in all those questions?
I'll try to start, and of course I'll bring it back to being about archives, because archives really are particularly in government archives, are the objective record of what happened when it happened. And it's because we have this document, we can see that justice was served and a decision got made. The attorneys, the judge, Hasbrook, all played an important role in dispensing justice. And knowing that, yes, Isabella van Wagenen didn't have standing, didn't have literacy, didn't have a lot of things, but they ensured that justice was done. And there are many other probably great examples of both justice and probably injustice within the many records that we have, including the court records. Those records span the entire length of the state's history. So we have records from the state education department where there was a lot of analysis of really unequal education programs and how the state was attempting to deal with really segregating schools and not doing the right thing and not being just in terms of delivering a quality education to every child in this state. And those are the kinds of stories that get told with records that people can use to say, this is how they took on the system and achieved justice in many, many different areas.
And if I can add to that, there are also things that aren't in the records. One of the things that I think we forget when we're talking about these figures of this case, we're also forgetting about the 23 grand jurors who really started this. 23 regular people from the community. They might have been farmers, they might have been shopkeepers, they might have been laborers. They're summoned, they come, they sit there, they listen to the cases that are coming. We don't know who they are, we don't know what they did. But I think completely overlooked is that it's their decision that day she appears at the courthouse that starts all of this. If they didn't issue that writ to Solomon Gedney, Solomon Gedney was a very well-known individual in the community. If they didn't do that, does anything else happen? I don't know. But I think the lesson to us is these records allow us to see what happened, and also part of what you do as a historian, amateur or otherwise, is you try and connect the dots. But the one thing you always understand is that behind you there's many people. There is the grand jury. There's the two attorneys who send her to the grand jury to actually testify. What if the first one just said, no, you don't belong here. You can't, what you're looking for, you're not going to get here. I mean, she was so adamant about this, I don't know that she would have quit, but there's so many things, there's so many people. And I think the lesson that we can take is taking these documents, taking what we know about the case, taking what we don't necessarily know about the case, and realize that regular people can do amazing things. All of us. Justice isn't just the courts, and I believe, bless you, I believe I've spent 30 years in the court system. I've spent every day trying to make sure that justice is done. And everybody I work with, everybody I've met does the same. But it's everybody. Every single one of us can do something to make the world a better place. Look, Sojourner Truth is a perfect example of that. Coming from relative, what we would say is she's got nothing. Look at what she did. You know, never learned how to read or write, and people have said, oh, thinking, oh, we should avoid that. Why? What strength? Look at what she overcame. Mm-hmm. She overcame a lot more than probably any of us here. We can all do that. So that's what justice is. Justice is every one of us doing the right thing every time.
But
do the
this
best.
is only one case, and it's in New York State, and it's in the Hudson Valley. And it's an extraordinarily strong woman who had the power of the Holy Spirit on her side, who we know from this part of her life and from the rest of her life that she was extraordinarily intelligent and powerful. That I said when I was standing here that Peter was trafficked, and at that time, in that place, his being trafficked was illegal. But at that time, in many other states in the United States, the trafficking of children was perfectly legal. This case could not have happened in many of the states of the United States. And I think that we know this, and that this happened, and that these people acted in an honorable and ethical way in the 1820s in the Hudson Valley. Really, it shows the shame of the rest of the country.
Absolutely. And that's even today, right? A lot of times when you hear people talk about their reactions to slavery or their families' creation of wealth through slavery, they say, well, there were people of their time. But I think this case shows that there wasn't a one-track mind for white people, right? That there were people who were fighting for justice and for doing the right thing. And this case is certainly one of those that shows when justice is done, and that people were not thinking along the same kind of line. Thank you all for this excellent discussion. We now have time for questions from our audience. So if you would go to the rear of this front area, there's a mic on either side, and just form a queue. And as you form the queue, I will try to get to as many of you as possible. We'll take our first question on this side, and then we'll go back and forth. Yes.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Danielle. Thank you so much to the panelists for the lecture. I gained so much knowledge, and I'm so happy that I opted to come here in person rather than virtual. So first I'd like to comment on the photo of Sojourner that was displayed. I felt like she's displeased with how we have failed to advance in the quest for liberty and justice, and that we can do better. And so my comment is, as a child, I always heard of Sojourner Truth. As a young adult, I realized I really never knew about her life. So I discovered the book by Jacqueline Bernard, Journey Towards Freedom. Definitely fascinated by what I discovered. And as someone who grew up influenced by the Pentecostal religion, I can definitely say that I felt led by the Holy Spirit to actually travel to Battle Creek, Michigan, and visit her gravesite, also the memorial that's there. I was disappointed to see that she's buried amongst average people, so to speak. No disrespect to them, but I felt like I expected to see her grave maybe set apart and memorialized. I wonder, because she is from Ulster County, New York, and also given the fact that Michigan has passed laws to restrict the teaching of racial history, to what extent does the onus lie on New Yorkers to raise awareness in Michigan and maybe use her story as a lesson on American history rather than racial history?
I mean, I think her story is so inspirational. I find it hard to believe anybody could really learn about her story and not be inspired. I mean, as far as she still has family members, descendants who live in Michigan. There isn't really an answer to that I know, except this. I think that if we do, everybody tries to make this a little bit better every day, we'll get there. I think that there's this idea that, things have to be done on a macro level, and everybody has to be, you have to be in this big position. And maybe my thinking has changed, but I think it is. This is a perfect example. We look at Sojourner Truth, she's that macro level. She didn't start that way, but I also look at all the other people involved, every little person who helped her along that way. I guess you know what you do everything you can, and you do it every day.
There's a second part to that question, actually. Because you mentioned as an archivist, one of the jobs is access. Is there cross-collaboration between states so that people from Michigan could have access to the archives in New York?
The records of the state archives here in New York are accessible to anyone on the planet. So, and yes, my colleagues at the Michigan State Archives are fully aware of what we have. The documents that we're displaying are available, of course, online now, and scanned and all of that. But the State Archives in New York is free and accessible to all.
Yes, and the documents tonight are digitized, as you just said. And if you registered with Eventbrite, you were sent that link this afternoon. If you were not sent that link, just see me afterwards, and I'll get it to you so that you can have access to them as well. Okay. Question over here.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for this illuminating panel. I have a two-part question. The first is for Dr. Painter. Given the significance of naming for newly freed slaves and changing names to embody the sort of, newfound liberty, I wondered if you could just answer the question about different historians referring to Sojourner Truth as Isabella Baumfree versus Van Wagenen, because you may have addressed this in your book, but I haven't read it yet. I'm going to. So if you could just answer that. And then the second question is for the archivist. I missed it on the way in, So I apologize if this is a redundant question, but could you give us a chronology of when the documents were actually found and then the lawyers were brought in to sort of discern the writs, et cetera? So those are my questions.
Yeah. Well, first of all, through human history, people have only had one name, basically. And so Isabella had one name, and her parents had one name. Her mother was Bet. So historians have tried to justify it, bring that into line with our preference for two names. Plus, when she went to New York City, she needed to have a last name. So she took the last name of her benefactors as she was self-emancipating, von Wagenen. But in the documents of New York City, you would see her referred to in different ways: Isabel, Isabella, Bell, von Wagenen, Wagener, and so on and so forth. And that's the usage of the time, the vernacular usage of the time. So there's not one right answer to what was her name until she named herself, or the power of the Holy Spirit named her. And I insist on that because I think we lose part of her if we don't recognize that power. You know, you've spoken very eloquently about the power of the law and the people who played their roles within that. But she couldn't have gotten to Kingston without the power of the Holy Spirit, as well as the powerful people around her. Yeah, I'll stop there.
The documents have been in the state archives for many years. So they've been that preservation role that we play. They were identified and really brought to light by my colleague Jim in January of this year. And just a plug for research. There are a lot more. There are many stories there that can still be told. And again, the State Archives is there. These are your records. Please use them.
All right, thank you.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time, and at least one person on the stage needs to catch a train upstate. However, for those on stage who are able to stay, those of you who still have those questions that you just can't leave here without knowing the answer to, maybe they'll be able to answer those for you or be able to answer those via email at some later point. I want to thank our guests, Dr. Nell Irvin Painter, Thomas Reller, and Paul O'Neill for this compelling conversation. And thank you to our audience, those who braved the rain and the wind and the terrible gray skies that we've been suffering through all day, and those who are tuned in from home. Thank you for attending this evening's program. If you've missed anything or you want to revisit this conversation, it will be preserved on the Schomburg Center's YouTube channel forevermore. So it will be there for you. And if you're in-house, I do want to say that you should grab a copy of the Schomburg Center's Fall 2022 schedule of programs and exhibitions. The Schomburg Center is home to over 11 million items that are dedicated to the history and cultures of people of African descent from around the world. And we do a lot of program and exhibitions that bring those to the fore for the public, and most of our events are for free. So be sure to grab one of these on your way out. Have a great night, everyone. Please get home safely, and thank you again for coming.